Welcome to the Data Matters webinar. My name is Menachem Perlman. I am the Director, Solution Engineering for API Security at Akamai. This is episode number 1 in a series of webinars. If you enjoyed this webinar, please register for the next webinars. Each will cover different topics. I really appreciate your time today. Today's content will be focused on a very technical, deep dive educational content, and I hope that you will learn a few new things. Let's start. Our first step will be to talk about why data matters and why it matters for API security. It might seem as you already collected data like telemetry, logs, alerts, or even raw data. You might think, quite frankly, why do I need to collect data for API security? Second, we will deep dive into different types of data and their importance. Not all types of APIs are required, but having the right data is essential. We will explore and learn about different types of data and see that not all types of data are the same, and we will give you some tips and regarding your data and how you can use it effectively today. As we move forward, we will look at a couple of stories to see a real life use case of an API cybersecurity attack that was discovered and mitigated by the Akamai API security solution together with the Shadow Hunters team. Then we will wrap it up with a few tips how to leverage your data. And of course, we will have some joke at the end, so stay tuned. Why API and data? When it comes to API security, alerts are important. However, in order to properly address these issues, we need information about all API-related activities and their data, not just the ones that are alerted or we told the system to start and collect some data about some specific traffic. Most companies understand the importance of the data, but I want you to think for a moment. Does your company really have all the information you need? And if you do, what about data privacy or long-term retention? What about compliance? Have you tried some exercise to see if you can catch and mitigate API attacks, threats, and abuse? I'm sure that you're telling to yourself, all of this is great questions. But how do I make sure that I have the right data to perform API security? I want to, jump for a second with an example to show you the difference between having data to having the right data. When looking at API activity data, getting the entire data that important. Let's take a look here in our example. On the left side, we have alerts, and on the right side, we have alerts with context and information. So you can see that it's really important to actually get the full context, not just the alerts activities. We jumped a little bit. Let's go back for a second and get full understanding about why data is matter. We tend to agree that it's important and helpful to have the data available to us. When you think about what an API activity is, not just API data, you notice that there are different types of data and related activities coming from various sources. These data are used differently. I wanted to pause for a second and imagine how data can help your organization and what it can be used for an API activity. I'm sure that some of you thought about following ideas as you can see here on the screen, like getting visibility and monitoring, compliance and governance, security, threat detection and threat response, and even identity and access management. First, let's take a look at the first one. What are the benefits of API activity data for visibility and monitoring? When you have access to the right data, you will be able to monitor API traffic in real time, enabling you to detect anomalies, unusual patterns, or potential threats to API security as soon as they occur. In order to identify potential vulnerabilities or unauthorized access, API activity data will help you to understand how the API being used, who accessing them, and the nature of the request and the responses. For example, you developed an API and shared it with another vendor who use that to fulfill orders, send payments, transactions, and more. You need to collect data and be alerted to abnormal behavior in order to determine how this third party is using API legitimately. So you need to collect the data regardless of if that's malicious or not malicious behavior, if you want to understand how the API is being used. What are the benefits of API activity data for compliance and governance? Compliance with regulatory requirements requires the right data, visibility, monitoring, and tools. Regulations such as PCI DSS and others require monitoring and securing sensitive information transmitted through APIs. Access to this data can help you to assist with compliance. When data is managed correctly, audit trails can be built, which can be used to demonstrate compliance with industry policies. Now, let's get a little bit more in depth to understand how does API activity data contributes to compliance and governance for PCI DSS. Some background for people that hearing about these terms at the first time. The PCI DSS is a regulatory framework in the cybersecurity world and other worlds, of course, that commonly used and require companies that dealing with credit cards, numbers, and more. And as part of the release of PCI DSS 4.0, you require to protect your API related data. And how that benefits security, analytics, and threat detection. Analyzing the API data can help you to identify potential threats, such as unusual spikes in the traffic, malicious payload, injection attacks, and abnormal user behavior. When you have the contextual data, like user metadata, endpoint access patterns, and even the payload content, that will enhance the ability to detect and prevent security breaches, such as XSS, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, and many more. When it comes to incident response and forensics, having the detailed data are vital that help you, and of course the forensics team, to perform analysis of events before and after a security breach is happening. Let's think about an example. Let's talk about a forensic situation. If you are dealing with an API security incident, you need more data. You need additional fields and also historical data from various sources, including internal APIs, external APIs, and even how third-party APIs are used. And you need all of that if you want to complete the investigation fast and understand the root cause and the situation. Without that, you might find yourself in a situation where you are unable to uncover the whole story and the situation. And the final topic is IAM, the Identity Access Management. Having the API related traffic is really important also for authentication and authorization, because users' data, identity data, plays a crucial role in securing APIs for access controls, user roles, permissions, and token-based authentication mechanisms to be effective. Having accurate data that needs to be provided in order to enforce adequate access controls. Now that we have reviewed the API activity data and understand why it is important for visibility, compliance, security, and identity, I want to move even more in-depth discussion regarding types of data. Since having data is important, right? We understand that having data is important, but having the right data is imperative. And not all data made equal in terms of quality and outcomes. Now, it's time to take a closer look at the types of the data. As we did previously today, I would like you to take a moment to think about what types of data you are familiar with and count. So think for a second and count how many types of data you can come up. And do you think that you have them? Do you think that what you have is enough for you? And I managed to count at least 10 different types of data, and I tried to put them into different buckets. Now, you might think, I already have all the API activity data, and most of them are pretty much the same. So what's new with data? In the next few slides, I wanted to try and give you some new information you might not be familiar with. So I thought to surprise you with some types of data you might not have thought about previously. So the first one is request and response payload. Understanding the data being transmitted helps to identify anomalies or malicious content. User and access logs. This log provides information regarding who accessed the API, when they access it, and from where they access, which is helpful in monitoring, controlling, and accessing to it. Having the metadata and headers, that's important because that can give you a context, but getting more details like the version and other metadata can help you with investigation. And the final one, security tokens and authentication data. The security tokens and authentication data are essential to secure access to your system. as they provide identification tokens, keys, and validation details. But actually, there are more. Let's start with the first one, the Swagger file. It's really important element that can be used to ensure API security by providing clear documentation, definition, security measures, and facilitating and validating and compliance checks. The business logic is also really important because you can treat the business logic also as a data. And it's also part of API security, of course. Understanding the behavior and meaning of APIs is essential to taking a holistic approach for API security. A number of attacks, for example, do not require zero-day patches or exploits. Rather, they take advantage of legitimate access by understanding the logic of the business. This is why business logic can also be treated as a type of data that your company need to understand how the business logic works, monitor the business logic, and make sure that you discover some abuse or attacks to that. Monitoring and detecting attacks based on reputations, IP, and domains, it's also really important as a data. So threat intelligence in general, it's also really important. And as a fundamental components of API security, security tokens and authentication data play a crucial role in using these elements. You are ensuring that only the authorized users and system can interact with the API and perform allowed actions, such as verification of identity using JWT or OAuth tokens. For example, if you want to secure and make sure that it's seamless authentication, you must have the tokens right and used. And AI label data. Of course, there is no great presentation without talking about AI or machine learning. But having labeled data is really important because if it's trained labeled and you have the data such as threat detection, anomaly detection, and pattern recognition, within your API, it can help you to mitigate advanced threats. And the final point, I would like to highlight a specific process and methodology that's also necessary to ensure the successful of implementation and use the data within the organization. So just having the data is not enough. But if you have your own processes and procedures that can help you to actually mitigate threats. So all of these 6 types of data, in my perspective, are also data. Yes, I know that maybe business logic is not a real data, as you might think about, but in a context of security, that's really important to look at that as a data. Now, let's pivot for a second and talk about how the Akamai API security works. First, we are not another inline solution. We leverage what you already have inline or other sources of traffic like API gateways, load balancer, proxies, CDNs, and much more. We deploy a policy to collect the traffic from your environment. You can think about it like a lawful intercept. It's out of band and asynchronous. It allows us to see the full payload of every request and response. And because of data and privacy concerns, we also deploy an Akamai security node to collect the data. The Akamai API security node performs tokenization to tokenize to replace any sensitive data by default. and you don't need to know about all of your data because these activities happen automatically. When we get the data from your environment, our Akamai API security data lake will keep the anonymized data and will perform the API discovery and risk audit, behavioral detection, and also can perform automated response by integrating with your own response solutions and perform everything fully automated. If you are using an Akamai solution, you can enable the Akamai product in a few clicks by leveraging the Akamai native connector that's already built in the product. You can just click on the button, get the API security solution, and even perform prevention by using the Akamai WAF and other security tools. And everything is embedded into one solution. You don't need to deploy anything or do any other configuration. Let's see a story. And let's go more deep dive investigation of an abnormal JSON property. And then we will talk about the second story about discovering a fraud in the traffic smoke screen. But a moment before we deep dive into the attack, I wanted to set up the stage and explain more about the Akamai Shadow Hunt service, or how we call them the Shadow Hunters. Because I will use this word a couple of times in the next few slides. For organizations that would like to leverage a team of API security experts, we have a service of an API security experts. And our Shadow Hunters managed threat hunting service, they work by examining your data as an extension to your team that allows you to focus on your business while Akamai focus on your API security and threat hunting. The threat hunting service gives you outcomes and deliverables like emerging threat reports. So if there's a news story in the news, the team will proactively hunt for threats in your environment, or a monthly status reviews, or ask the expert. You can talk to them, you can talk to people and ask them to get more data about threats discovered by the API security solution. Let's start by looking at our first use case, abnormal JSON property. What is an abnormal JSON property? An endpoint that accepts data, usually those using post, put, or patch methods. They receive the data in the request payload. In a specific case, we had an API consumer that sent a request to an endpoint with additional JSON properties that were never seen before. Now, this could indicate a change in the endpoint specification, or an attacker that probing the API to see whatever it accepts additional properties, or trying to bypass the access control. The Akamai API security solution, using the data lake, keeps the customer information and also the behaviors and the parameters and the patterns. And on that specific endpoint, based on previous behaviors and abnormal behavior models, the product discovered that the property token and the shopper token and news password in the JSON body was different. And that's why the system alerted about that and performed discovery and remediation, everything fully automated. And think about that. Will you notice that, for example, that the new password looks strange? But the product that can track all the parameters, the service, and the endpoint managed to discover this abnormal behavior. Let's take a look at the second example, the noise in the smoke screen. Attackers sometimes perform some noise to cover up their activities, or you might call that a smoke screen. Recently, a large company experienced an abnormal spike in their API's traffic. This is responsible for some of their paid per view services. You can think about that. I have a service that I'm exposing, and people can register and pay per each time they are using that service, like pay per view. At first, the company thought that this is just another DDoS activity, distributed denial of service, that occurs from time to them and mitigated and blocked by their existing solutions. But after digging deeper into the data, and specifically the business logic of the data, they realized that the story is actually different this time. This was a credit card stuffing attack, where attackers obtained a list of credit cards and validated them. And the customer system actually responded with either true or false, depending on whether that card was valid. Because of the breadth and the data, specifically of the business logic, the Akamai API security solution allowed the customer to identify, investigate, and block within minutes to make sure that this threat is mitigated. Great. As a summary, let's understand and see what we learned today. In today's session, we learned that it's not enough to have the data. It's important to have the right data and in the right context. Data is more than just the logs. Data can be also machine learning and label data and AI label data, business logic, and of course swaggers and much more. We learned how the Akamai API security product works with quick and easy implementation and also ability to mitigate privacy concerns about dealing with sensitive data, and also how that can be blocked. Finally, we saw two stories about how attackers are leveraging APIs and business logic to perform abuse and attacks. Great. This is the final slide of today. If you enjoyed the session today, I highly recommend you to register for the next one that will happen on February 27. Thank you very, very much for joining today's session. I will wish you a great day. Oh, I promised you a joke, but I'm not sure if you will get that. So give it some time to rest.